Chapter 3 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bittersweet, twilight and evening star, and after that the dark, and let there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the tide may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. At the time referred to in the last chapter, 1857, no ships or other vessels, as we called all sea-going craft drawing more than about 12 feet, which visited Newburn, could enter our port, and as there was a bar in the sound which every ship was obliged to cross, either coming or going, it was necessary that our good schooner Laura Johnson should be lightered over the bar, that is to say, a small vessel denominated a lighter carrying her deck load should accompany her over the bar and transfer the same, her load, to her deck. This occupied at least a day at that time, and afforded such of the passengers as inclined an opportunity of visiting some of the small rocky islands which line the coast in that vicinity, on which very many aquatic fowls were accustomed to lay their eggs and hatch out their young. On this occasion 2 of the vessel's crew and several of the passengers, including my elder sister, took advantage of the invitation and went ashore, returning after an absence of several hours with a goodly quantity of eggs, which the cook prepared and served for us. I am not certain that at this writing I should care to indulge in the eating of those eggs, for I was in profound ignorance as to the kind of species of birds that laid them, or the length of time they had lain amongst the rocks before they were gathered and served to us. Of one thing I am sure, the flavour which remained in my mouth after partaking of them was not reassuring. Without wearying the reader with the details of this sea voyage, which skirted the coast of North Carolina and Maryland until we sailed serenely up New York Bay and lay at anchor snugly in the harbour on the Brooklyn side, I will remark that at times, especially when we were doubling Cape Hatteras, the so-called dread of seamen, we had excitement enough for the most exacting. The monster waves, billows, piled up like Ossa on Pelion in poetic phrase, heaved on Olympus. Tottering Ossa stood, on Ossa Pelion nods with all his wood. Since then I have crossed the Atlantic Ocean 8 times, but nothing within my own personal experiences has equalled what I then endured, tumbled out of my berth upon my head, with part of our luggage upon me. Cabined and cribbed for days within our stateroom, not very stately at that, terrified when the billows mountain high threatened to engulf us, and when our little 2-masted schooner, like a cockle-shell, hung trembling on the crest of a mighty wave, I for one imagined that my end had come, and could not with the unhappy Moor say, if after every tempest come such calms, may the winds blow till they have wakened death, and let the labouring bark climb hills of seas, Olympus high, and deck again as low as hells from heaven. One thing interested me very much, even amid the thundering of the billows and the strident sounds of the winds playing amongst the rigging. That was the captain, when in stentorian tones he gave his commands to the helmsman at the wheel, which enabled our sturdy bark to dodge the dangers and weather the gale, none the worse, apparently, for her perilous voyage. When an extra heavy wave came thundering toward us, our captain would shout, "Right about," and then, after the imminence of the danger had passed, his voice would ring out, "A hard lay," and so time and again he would exert his authority and skill, until after hours which seemed days we were sailing, gliding over comparatively smooth seas, toward our sure haven of rest. Who, now living, can vividly recall before their minds the appearance of little old New York in 1857, 63 years ago, when by the latest census she contained within her walls about 450,000 souls, a few less than half the number now credited to the great city of Cleveland? Who can picture the appearance of her forest of masts, and complexity of the spars and riggings, like the tangles of Neaera's hair, as one surveyed her spacious harbour in those early days? vastly changed, I think, from their appearance in 1837, when my dear father visited that city for the purpose of buying a stock of goods. Yet, oh, how different than she is to-day! It was in the early morning of July 3rd, when our ship was moored to her Brooklyn dock, near Washington Street, only a few rods distant from the Brooklyn end of the first great suspension bridge. Within the present decade I have looked down from the great bridge and seen the identical little house in which we spent our first night in that great city. Nor can I ever forget the following day, the first 4th of July I had ever spent in a northern city. What we saw and what we heard, both by day and by night, almost startles me even now. Imagine then, if you can, what an impression was made on my mind when I was only 12 years of age. The first 4th of July celebration I had enjoyed outside of my little native town, excepting only the time when I ran away from my home and walked 20 miles to the village of Trenton to hear the eagle scream, and then neither saw nor heard him, saw and ate fat pig instead, and heard the dulcet notes of the violin and the cornet. Before leaving my Southern home, my dear mother gave me a $50. "John," she said, "you are a big eater. Now when we get to New York, if we are invited out to dinner by any of our old friends, don't try to eat everything on the table. Eat a reasonable amount, and if you are not satisfied, go out and buy a little something to piece it out. But make this $50 go as far as you can." I fear my dear good mother lost sight of the fact that I was, after all, only a patriotic little boy, as the sequel proved, for before the glare of the rockets and Roman candles became evident at the setting of the sun, I had invested every cent of that $50 in a little brass pistol and suitable ammunition for it. Could I have made better use of it? Could I ever have bought more happiness in one day with it? I think not, and although the error of my conduct was called forcibly to my attention at times during many succeeding years, yet I am free to say I have never regretted my conduct in that behalf, for it stimulated my love for my country and her glorious flag, which is the only one which shelters and protects us at home or abroad by virtue of our Constitution and laws. The next day was Sunday, if I mistake not, and my baby sister, 7 years of age, and I attended a Sunday school in the neighborhood. It was the first time in the life of either of us that we had ever been seated with white children. Oh, how happy we were, and how lustily we did sing for the first time those dear little nursery hymns, "Little drops of water, little grains of sand," etc., and that other one, "I want to be an angel, and with the angel stand, a crown upon my forehead, a harp within my hand." This was the beginning only of what was to follow in our little far-away Ohio home. Eye had not seen, ear had not heard, neither had it entered into our infantile hearts, the joys that were laid up for us in the not distant future. The pleasure derived from our brief sojourn in New York was greatly intensified by the association of some of our old New Bern friends, one of whom had been a fellow member with my father of Christ Episcopal Church down there. He guided us through the labyrinthine streets, pointed out to us objects of interest, and explained them to us. And when our crated goods were released from the hold of the good ship Laura Johnson, he kindly saw that they were shipped on one of the canal boats of the Erie Canal en route to Cleveland. His name was Mr. Richard W. Hancock, a skilled carpenter and builder who had planned and constructed some of the most ornate buildings in our hometown before he deserted it. Mr. Hancock was the only titler of a white Masonic lodge in a slave state that I have ever heard of or seen, marching with drawn sword at the head of a white Masonic procession. Where he was made, or how he won recognition in that town 20 years before the Civil War, is more than I can explain, and what makes his treatment the more remarkable lies in the fact that, though not a pure-blooded Negro, yet his color was pronounced, unmistakable. On the afternoon of the 6th of July, 1857, accompanied and assisted by our worthy friend Mr. Hancock, we boarded a day car of the Erie Railway Company, and our adieus having been said, we were on our way to Dunkirk, the western terminus of that railroad. At that time, I say, we boarded a day car. Yes, for to the best of my memory and information, there were no sleeping cars in existence at that time. That there were no Wagner, Pullman, or double-day cars on that or any other line, I am quite certain, and persons wishing to dine accommodated themselves from the hampers which they carried with them. And as for sleeping, they were restricted to doubling up on a seat or disposing their bodies in the next most convenient manner. We must not lose sight of the fact that not only the Erie but most of the other railroads in this country were at that time of recent or comparatively recent construction, and as a direct result of that fact the roadbeds were very poorly ballasted or not at all. On the Erie road the riding was rough. There were sections of that thoroughfare so rough that one would almost imagine himself riding in a stage coach. The rails were light, the springs were poor, and the couplings between the cars were so very loose and insecure that smooth, easy riding was out of the question. Estimated the distance between New York and Cleveland by that route to have been 600 miles, we maintained an average speed of about 25 miles an hour, for we were just 24 hours in reaching our destination. However, the whole trip was crammed full of pleasure for this writer, whatever may be said as to the other members of our party, and when at about 5 o'clock P.M. on the 7th day of July, 1857, our train drew into the first Union Depot, years before our present old Union Depot was considered or planned, our joy exceeded expression. At last, thank God, we were on Ohio soil. Finally, we were in the beautiful forest city of Cleveland, with its population of 36,000 souls, its grand public square, and its long, broad, ornate streets, cool and refreshing to look upon. The bluff was high and steep at the northern extremity of what is now West 9th Street, then called Water Street, and years afterwards it took a deal of grading to reduce it to its present form. As we reached the summit of the bluff, there were two objects quite conspicuous which are no longer in existence. On the right, a few rods distant, stood the government lighthouse, commanding a view of Lake Erie for many miles out, while on the left-hand side Bethel Church raised its spire gloriously in the air. It was warm and very dusty. The lake breeze then, as now, to some extent, was continually in motion, and raised the dust from the unpaved streets to the great discomfort of all pedestrians. But even then the young people were in numerous instances out on the curbs, sprinkling the streets, since the waterworks had for a year or more been established and was coming gradually into use. Superior Street from the public square to West 9th Street was covered with boards, and on the south side of that chief business thoroughfare from the square to Bank Street, West 6th Street, the buildings were principally of wood. The public square was enclosed with a sort of fence on all four sides, while the interior was carpeted with green lawns and shaded by beautiful elm and maple trees. The southwestern section of the public square contained a little antiquated courthouse, which reminded me strongly of the old courthouse which we had left behind in New Bern. I could go on and mention many of the structures existing in Cleveland at that time, but a mere enumeration of them would tire the reader, I fear. Mr. Freeman H. Morris, one of the most intelligent, conservative, and genteel colored men then residing in Cleveland or elsewhere in the United States, was the proprietor of a tailoring establishment under the Bennett House, a hotel subsequently enlarged and christened the Forest City House. On the opposite corner, where now is located Marshall's Drug Store, was located Rouse Block, built and owned by Deacon Rouse, one of the most prominent of the pioneers of this city. Rouse Block was for its day large and ornamental, and was greatly admired by its owner and community in general. There was one theater in the city, the Academy of Music, of which the late John A. Elsler was the proprietor. He maintained a stock company of which he was the leading star. Miss Effie Elsler, his wife and mother of the younger Effie Elsler, who was then a baby, was the leading lady. There was a tragedian of much merit by the name of McCullough, James Lewis, inimitable comedian, and Miss Anna Dickinson, soubrette. It was with other characters a good company, and played regularly for the entertainment and instruction of this community. Occasionally during the season great stars would visit the city and entertain the habitués and others of that theater. I remember well the Marble Heart, in the production of which the late John Wilkes Booth, assassin of President Lincoln, was the star attraction. Also Edwin Booth, Cool Doc Sothern, father of E.H. Sothern, now prominent as our interpreter of some of Shakespeare's plays, and many others. The old building, transposed, still occupies its original site in West 6th Street, contiguous to the old Kennard House, then called the Anger House. The auditorium of the theater was on momentous occasions boarded over and used for balls given in honor of distinguished personages. It was the largest public auditorium then at the command of the citizens of Cleveland. Melodeon Hall was another hall provided with a stage and scenery. It was located on the present site of Mr. Jacob B. Perkins' big building, the Wiltshire, on the north side of Superior Street, near West 3rd Street. It is the building used for a post office while the present post office was in course of construction. There was also another hall, a small one, in a building located on the present site of the Williamson building, called at one time Garrett's Hall, and another on the top floor of a building which stood where the American Trust building is now located, Chase Hall. There were no places of business on either Superior Street or Euclid Avenue east of the public square, and on the north side of the public square the entire space was filled with ornate residences. Prospect Street ranked second in importance as a residence street, and Woodland Avenue third. There were also beautiful residences on Lake and St. Clair Avenue up to Erie Street, now East 9th, and also on Ontario Street from the public square to the lake. There was a pontoon bridge spanning the river at the foot of West 3rd Street, Seneca Street, and a ferry established to transport persons across the river at the foot of Superior Street Hill. The old stone church stood like a grim sentinel where it stands today. The tall spire had recently been destroyed by fire. It has never been replaced. On the corner of East 4th, Sheriff Street, and Euclid Avenue stood St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and in Superior Street, between the public square and East 6th Street, Bond Street, was located both Trinity Cathedral and the Second Presbyterian Church. The Second Baptist Church, now denominated Rockefeller's Church, was then located on the northeast corner of East 9th Street, Erie Street, and Central Avenue, Ohio Street. To the north of Ohio Street and on the south side of the cemetery was a broad space of land whereon the county fair was held that year. Miss Lucy Reitman, the beautiful and accomplished daughter of the late David L. Whiteman, one-time sheriff of Cuyahoga County, Ohio, carried away the prize as the most skillful equestrienne of all those who contended for it. The Central High School building was located where the Citizens Loan and Trust Company's building now stands, in Euclid Avenue near East 9th Street, while the First Baptist Church, which had formerly occupied a building at the corner of Champlain Avenue and West 3rd Street, was then located on the present site of the Hickox building, northwest corner of Euclid Avenue and East 9th Street. There was a pretty little park located on the bluff overlooking the lake at the foot of what is now East 17th Street, called Clinton Park. There is now little or no reminder of the fact that it ever existed. This was at a time anterior to the establishment of Lake View Park, when the side of the hill between Lakeside Avenue and the railroad tracks was covered with little Irish shanties. It is a curious commentary on our ephemeral existence that both the shanties and the park have already yielded to the march of events. Much could be said of the fire department, which I say we, advisedly, drew to the occasional fires with our hands, the engines and trucks, and pumped with the same power. It was a slow, laborious process, and often quite uncertain, but it was better than none, as well as a source of much recreation. It was midsummer, and time was winging his flight. It is a true saying, eternally true, that time and tide wait for no man, and this writer was not using it wisely. On the contrary, he was scouring the city and its environs with no useful employment, not even the woodpile, to occupy his time at the imminent risk of getting into trouble. And it was easily evident that my mother must place me under the guardian care and protection of someone who would curb and restrain me, temporarily at least. After mature reflection and much anxiety, she finally determined to take me to Oberlin, Ohio, and give me to that Mr. John Patterson, for whom my father named me. And on the following day we found a hearty welcome in the home of that man to whom, of all other persons, we're indebted for our presence in Oberlin at that time. After refreshment, mother opened up the subject foremost in her mind, and disclosed to Mr. Patterson the object of her visit to Oberlin, to place in his custody her only son as an apprentice, to be taught his trade, that of a bricklayer and plasterer. Now Mr. Patterson already had on his hands several husky boys for whom he could hardly find employment, and he frankly stated his inability to employ another boy for any purpose. Moreover, he said his calling required a boy in his teens, strong and heavy, while I was thin and weak, for a lad of 12 years of age, for whom he could find no employment. Under the circumstances, he advised my mother to go to the husband of one of her relatives, Mr. John H. Scott, harness maker, saddler, and trunk maker, who he thought could teach me one or more of his trades, which did not call for great size or robust strength. This proposition seemed quite promising to mother, who indeed was grasping at any temporary straw in that behalf, and she stayed not on her going, but went without delay. Cousin Celia Scott, the kindly, lovable spouse of John H. Scott, received me joyously, and encouraged, promoted the plan of taking me into her household enthusiastically. And to make a long story short, an oral agreement was made between Mr. Scott and my mother, by the terms of which I was to enter his employment as an apprentice, and remain with him until I attained to my 21st year. Mr. Scott agreed to treat me as his own child, to feed me at his own table, clothe me, and give me a little education. I'm not sure as to this last condition of the contract, but since both my mother and Mr. Scott had been denied an education, I infer the intention was that I should have some opportunities at least along that line. In pursuance of this very reasonable agreement, I entered Mr. Scott's employ, and became a part of his household, all of whom, excepting Mr. Scott, were related to me by ties of blood, and without delay he set me to work, making straps with buckles sewed on one end of them, and other small preliminary work, not forgetting to teach me how to milk a cow, which gave several gallons of milk, and fetch water in a bucket from a neighbouring pump, for washing purposes, and for cooling off a great poker, which weighed between 400 and 500 pounds, and suffered much by reason of July heat. Another duty which was quite pleasing to me was to carry a basket of fruit to the railway station at least once each day, and offer it for sale to passengers en route on the train. I tried to milk that cow, but, honour bright, it was for me the most onerous task I had ever undertaken, not excepting that done on the woodpile. I did not have sufficient strength in my wrists, and try as I would, I invariably botched the job, as I can now see. On one occasion, after I had milked several quarts into the pail, Bossy put one of her feet into it, and on withdrawing it, she left in the pail a small lump of clay, which had been sticking to it. I clutched the clay, and threw it out of the pail, but not before it had been dissolved more or less, and left a thick sediment on the bottom. Reason and the dictates of honesty told me to empty out of the pail that polluted milk, and finish milking, but I was too timid and fearful of Mr. Scott, whose commanding figure and black eagle eye at that period of his life almost made me tremble. I should have stated at the outset that mother, in taking leave of me after she had given me to Mr. Scott, said, "Mr. Scott, John is a bad boy, and you must whip him," a remark which to this day, 63 years since it was uttered, still rings in my ears. So I carried the milk into the house, mud and all. It was noticed that I did not drink any of it, but this did not call forth any special comment until the bottom of the crock was reached, when lo and behold, a sediment of clay unmistakable. "Aha!" exclaimed Mr. Scott, "now I know why you have not drunk any milk to day. I thought it was funny you were not drinking any milk to day. Now I know the reason why. Hereafter, sir, you have got to drink some of every milking." I may add he was as good as his word, and during the remainder of my sojourn with him I was required to at least sample the result of my milkings. And so the time wore on. My mother's cousin, Mrs. Scott, was kind and affectionate towards me, and at times, when her husband seemed rather severe in his dealings with me, she expostulated with him. She also had me scrub the kitchen floor for her occasionally, for which she invariably gave me a dime or 15 cents, which I religiously saved in order that I might accumulate a fund sufficient to pay my fare to Cleveland and return, when I made a promised visit to my mother on the 15th of September, my elder sister's 19th birthday. In the latter part of August there came to Oberlin a trainload of boys and girls on a picnic excursion. They were Sunday school pupils from that same Bethel church of which I have spoken heretofore. Mr. Scott permitted me to go into the grove and commingle with the children, but of course he expected me to return home in time to milk the cow. However, my nostalgia, homesickness, was so great that I could not withstand the temptation to visit my people, and when the train returned to Cleveland, I was one of the youthful excursionists. On reaching Cleveland, I went as the crow flies to my mother's home, 2 miles distant at the corner of Pine and Hudson, now East 30th Streets. There were no streetcars in those days, or any other means of reaching there, save walking. Mother and sisters were surprised and overjoyed to see me, and covered me with caresses, but mother was quite naturally apprehensive that I would have trouble with Mr. Scott on my return. As to this she was quite right, for though I stowed away in an oil closet on a freight train and returned to Oberlin by midnight of the same day, he declared he would have tanned my hide if I had not carried a letter to him from my mother requesting him to pardon this offence. At the same time he warned me not to repeat the act, a warning which, had I been wise, I would have heeded. However, young lads at the age of 12 years are not as a rule wise and prudent, especially if, as in my case, they have spent their whole life roaming amidst the pines and sands of North Carolina, without the friendly advice and guidance of a loving father, and with none of, or very few, examples set before him in his daily walk of life. In the course of a week or two, Henry O. Patterson, a foster son of that John Patterson for whom I was named, a boy older and more experienced than I, persuaded me to jump a freight car with him and make a flying trip to Cleveland and return, and I, having been so successful in escaping punishment in the first instance, fell an easy victim to his wiles. The trip outward was easily and successfully negotiated without mishap of any sort, and we passed a very pleasant afternoon in perambulating the marts of trade and the beautifully shaded boulevards of the forest city. Also we experienced no difficulty in snugly ensconcing ourselves in an oil closet of a freight car en route to Oberlin at midnight of the same day. But alas and alack, when we reached Elyria, some 8 miles from our destination, to our unspeakable surprise we were discovered and rudely accosted by a gruff and heartless brakeman, who flashed his light in our faces and in very plain English told us to get off our perch and leave the car. What was done, what to do, a glance told us both, and we easily recognized that we were up against a condition. No theory. So without parleying we jumped off into the outer darkness, for it seemed to be the darkest night we had ever seen. Henry O., thoroughly frightened and less daring than this writer, stayed off, walked the remainder of the distance, and put in his appearance at home early in the following morning. But the writer hereof, venturesome as ever, vaulted onto a platform car, piled high with lumber, reached home, and was sound asleep in the arms of Morpheus at about 1 o'clock a.m. To my surprise and horror, at about 5 o'clock in the same morning, Mr. Scott, master, entered my bedroom, carrying in his strong right hand a leather strap, resembling very closely those which I had been engaged in manufacturing, threw back the bedclothing with which I was covered, and proceeded to give me one of those tannings with which he had threatened me before. For in this instance I did not return to him armed with a supplicating letter from my mother. Suffice it to state that upon the conclusion of his tanning process, and for several days thereafter, my tawny hide presented an appearance more resembling that of a zebra than of a human being, and smarting from the unmerciful castigation, I had resolved to quit Mr. Scott for ever, even though in attempting escape I should imperil or even lose my life. Jacta est alia. The die was cast, the handwriting was on the wall, and from that moment it was absolutely beyond the power of my cruel master to retain me in his employ, unless indeed he shackled, hobbled, or imprisoned me, which, of course, in Oberlin at that time was out of the question. The reader must not lose sight of the fact that at that time I weighed exactly 50 pounds. I am constrained to confess that in my opinion I deserved some punishment for my misconduct in the premises, but without brutality and heartlessness. During the ensuing week never did the fates weave a web with more precision and certainty than did I in my determination to make my escape from Mr. Scott. The opportunity came, as I supposed, in the afternoon of the following Sunday, when I erroneously judged that he and his guest, a Mr. Smith, fugitive slave, were conversing together in the parlour. Tying up in a handkerchief my little belongings, I made a rush out of the back door for the garden. "John," a voice rang in my ears, "where are you going to?" If a clap of thunder out of a cloudless sky had saluted me, I would not have been more surprised or shocked than when I heard that voice. Turning and looking upwards, I beheld my bête noire, with his fugitive guest, sitting at the rear window upstairs. Then indeed I stayed not on the order of my going. I flew, bundle discarded. I ran with might and main in the direction of the little cemetery, then in the heart of the town, pursued by Mr. Scott and the other person. Backwards and forwards and crosswise the chase held its course, with the quarry gradually widening the space between himself and his pursuers, until the writer, seeing the futility of running in a circle, at length made for the track of the Lake Shore Railroad, and pitched his trend in the direction of Cleveland, 33 miles away, with Elyria intervening 8 miles distant. It was a hot September day, never to be forgotten by me. My thirst was great, but my fear and excitement was greater. Mile after mile we sped, my pursuers gradually narrowing the space between us. My tongue almost literally hung out of my mouth, and my heart beat like that of a doe pursued and bayed by the hunter and his hounds. At a distance of about 5 miles from Oberlin, I suddenly darted from the direct forthright, and quickly concealed my poor dying form amidst the underbrush. They searched for me in vain. They could not find me. Reluctantly they gave up the chase, faced homeward on the railroad track, and began their retreat. Unfortunately, inexperienced and excited as I was, I resumed my progress on the track, too, thinking that he had abandoned the pursuit, the space between us now being so great. Not so, for turning and getting a glimpse of my form, they renewed the pursuit, and gaining on me, for I was now afflicted with serious rectal trouble, so great had been the strain, I again concealed myself in the undergrowth of a neighboring wood. Again they were thwarted in their efforts to find me, but at the moment when they had decided to abandon the quest, the little dog which accompanied them, a pet of mine, scented me and began to bark and play with me. The jig was up. I was seized, undressed, tied as to my hands, and cruelly whipped with switches cut in the woods until my little thin body was well covered with purple welts. My pockets were searched, and all the earnings which I had received from my dear cousin Celia for scrubbing the kitchen taken from me, so that, as Mr. Scott declared, I could not pay my fare to my home and friends. Then I was compelled to promise that never again would I attempt to leave his home and employ, the white fugitive slave looking on the while, but uttering no word of protest. Slowly, painfully, I wended my way back to Oberlin, a forlorn, woebegone little boy. I wondered, could my father look down from heaven upon his poor child, whose birth was hailed with acclaims of joy and satisfaction as being the only son? Was this then all the result of his strenuous life in behalf of his family and humanity? Such is life. The next day I was lowered into a rain-water cistern to assist in cleaning it out. The water was cold, and I was sick, hardly able to stand without support. But that same kind Providence which tempers the wind to the shorn lamb was by my side, supporting and encouraging me. Was my spirit broken? Had the Stanley chestnut blood quailed before that of another? Never, young as I was. It was another case of lay on Macduff, and damned be he who first cries hold enough. Note, such of my relations of African descent as I had met or heard of were persons of mild, gentle dispositions on the female side. The men I did not know. For a full week after this torture I was not allowed to peddle fruit at the railway station. I was cabined and cribbed, watched, spied on, lest I should break my word and take French leave again. However, on one fine September afternoon, Mr. Scott said, "John, if I give you a basket of apples, do you think you can go to the station and sell them and come back all right?" I said yes. "Well, go on," he replied, "and see to it that you behave yourself and get back on time." With the basket filled with golden fruit, I sallied forth to the station. Ere long the fast express train flew in. Thunderbolt, they called it, and all was bustle and excitement. But to the quiet observer there appeared the vision of a little clay-coloured boy, quietly tucking himself away beneath one of those passenger cars, on the brake beam, to be exact, hugging some portion of the truck, while he inclined his head forward to escape the floor of the car above him. The bell rang, the whistle gave a toot, and slowly that great modern miracle, that locomotive, puffed its way forward, drawing after it the serpentine train, filled with living, breathing human beings, and a boy underneath. Remember, O reader, this was in September 1857, 63 years ago, when that railroad was in swaddling clothes, when the track was new and well nigh without ballast, and the springs were crudely made, and insufficient for the strain placed upon them. Was I the first to make the venture? At first I was in glee over the thought that I had finally eluded Mr. Scott, that no speed on his part could now overtake me, and that in an hour I would be once more under the same roof with my mother and sisters. However, a rapid change came over my mind, and terror seized upon me, as darkness almost Egyptian enveloped me. Dust, dust, dust in my eyes, in my nostrils, and even in my mouth, when I opened it to prevent suffocation. Upon my head I wore a soft green felt hat, which, from long use, had become peaked. I snatched it off, and while I clung to a rod with one hand, with the other I fanned for dear life in the vicinity of my nose. My first thought was to try to jump from under the car, but my judgment told me that I would be cut in two should I attempt to do so. In the course of 10 or 15 minutes the speed of the cannon-ball was so swift that the dust was drawn through by the current of air, and no longer menaced me. But now another danger, as serious, perhaps, as the first, succeeded to it. The speed of the train was such that the car under which I was located began to bound and rebound, threatening every instant to fracture my skull, or at least to stun me, which would have meant speedy and certain death. In this emergency I bent myself almost double in order to clear my head from the bottom of the car, in which I was successful until the train reached Elyria, when I crawled out and climbed into the car. The conductor, who was on the platform at the time, did not notice me until the train was in motion again, but meanwhile I was the cynosure of all the eyes in that car. I had the appearance of an animated statue carved out of clay. "Where did you come from?" exclaimed the conductor. "From under the car," I squeaked in return. "From under the car," he repeated. "Well, I am late, or I would stop and put you off." This time again the fates were with me, and I remained huddled in a corner until the joyful sound "Cleveland" inspired me with new life and activity. "Send him back," Mr. Scott wrote to my mother, "and I will make a man of him," a feat of which he boasted in after years. But after mature reflection it was decided that I should remain at home and go to school, a fact which filled me with joy beyond description. I will say here and now that for many years I have entertained no hatred or malice against Mr. Scott, by reason of his treatment of me. His was a hard school, and he acted according to his best lights. During the 6 weeks I was in his care, custody, and control, he fed me well, gave me a pair of shoes, allowed me to attend the picnic, and seated me at the table to dine with himself and family. Very considerate indeed, but he was too harsh, severe, and cruel to manage a mere child. I will add that in after years Mr. Scott was frequently my guest and I his, and further that I wrote his obituary after his death, which was in accordance with the Latin maxim, de mortuo tique nil nisi bonum, say nothing of the dead except good. If what I have written in the foregoing seems to imply bitterness and hatred, or a stern regret for having been apprenticed to Mr. Scott at that time and place, let it be known that I consider the experiences which, even at that tender age, I passed through in dear old Oberlin, outweigh in pleasure and profit all the disappointments and trial which fell to my lot, and which were due in part to my intractable disposition. Had I never spent those 6 weeks in Oberlin in 1857, when the town was just 24 years of age, I would not be able to carry to my grave with me the remembrance of the great Reverend Charles Finney, as he appeared in the pulpit of the First Church. The music of his sweet-sounding, earnest voice would not now be ringing in my ears as I heard it, when in those days he paced that pulpit and contended for human liberty, women's rights, temperate Christian lives, and all that make for civilization and ultimate salvation. I would never have seen, perchance, Father Keep, Professors Monroe, Shirtliff, Fairchild, Peck, Morgan, and others who did so much to place Oberlin on the proud pedestal where she stands today. I would not have met the late John Patterson, for whom I was named, who wrote to my dear mother those persuasive letters which eventuated in bringing her with her little brood to the city of Cleveland, nor could I now at this late day refer back to those early days when old Tappan Hall stood still majestic, when old chapel was still in its glory, and the music of the boardwalks added zest to the movement of the early students. These and many other characteristics of Oberlin 63 years ago pass in panoramic review before my mind, a rich legacy of those early times which I would not exchange for gold or silver or precious stones. End of chapter 3.